I'm hoping everyone will be able to hear me all right. If you find that I'm talking too quietly, please give me a sign and I will try to speak a little bit louder. So I feel a little bit like the odd one out in the sense that most of the papers that I've heard have involved cases or some examination of case studies where NTA has in some way, shape, or form been implemented, and minority rights as a whole have been acknowledged by state structures and officials. And the case that I'm looking at here is very different in that we're looking at the situation faced by members of a beleaguered minority group, the Talish in Azerbaijan, and the way that their sort of fate has developed in the independence period post-1991. And what we've seen as a whole is that while certain rights are imbued within legislation, while they're present on paper, these rights exist only on paper. They're about as thin, as flimsy as the paper upon which they are written. So like many of you, my interest in NTA and even territorial autonomy stems from the fact that I think that there's always more that can be learned. There's always something else that can be done. And so even in illiberal contexts such as Azerbaijan, we, those like myself who are studying the region and studying the country, we ought to still keep these issues in the back of our mind because authoritarian regimes are not everlasting. There's always hope that the situation will change in the future. And in the meantime, how best might we protect or support minorities and their rights in whatever way, shape, or form is allowed under the given political regime, for example. So I will say as well that I'm currently working on a small, we are a small international team of researchers there's myself based at the University of Eastern Finland and two other professors who are based in Sweden, in Malmö and Lund. And we have a comparative case study that looks at how authorities in various regime types, from authoritarian to democratic to semi-democratic, how they work to integrate, or if they work to integrate minority groups at all, minority groups that are territorially concentrated in border regions, and more specifically, minority groups who at some point in their history of existence within the contemporary nation-state system, and particularly after 1991, there have been attempts at not necessarily secession, but the establishment of some sort of autonomy by members of these minority groups. So as our three case studies, we have the Russian-speaking population in Idaviru in Estonia. We have the Armenian population in Georgia's Samtskhe-Javakheti border region. And then we have the case that I'm speaking about now, which is the Talish minority group in southeastern Azerbaijan. So that's a little bit about the project and my role within it. So I'm a human geographer by training, and I'm particularly interested in learning more about the relationships that people and collectives come to form with given places and how these relationships change over time. And in this case, what I was looking to find out more about is the ways that the symbolic and material factors come together to interact to create a particular outcome. So what particular outcome am I speaking about in this case? Here, I'm talking about the securitized environment of Azerbaijan's relationship, or the political center's relationship with its minority communities, particularly the Talish community in the southeast, as I had mentioned. So again, what kinds of symbolic and material practices come together to construct and to reconstruct, disseminate, legitimize this particular securitized environment? And so when interrogating these sorts of questions, it's impossible not to come across information regarding the Talish Muhan Republic. Not a lot of people are perhaps aware that actually in the summer of 1993, as war was raging in Nagorno-Karabakh, political intrigue within the governing circles changes in political leadership in Azerbaijan. All of this was a very tumultuous period. And at the same time, we also had a couple of minority groupings looking to potentially break away or to establish some sort of autonomy within or outside of Azerbaijan. That depends upon the particular context. But the Talish minority in the southeast, certain representatives of this minority had attempted to create an autonomous republic, the Talish Mukhan Republic. It existed for a very brief period of time, from about June to August of 1993, but for its very brief existence, it has had an extremely important and long-lasting impact upon the development of state-society relations, majority-minority relations in Azerbaijan. And that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today in this paper, which I would also like to note is very much a work in progress. So I will be asking some questions maybe that we can think about together towards the end of the presentation, and I would very much value your input as well if you have any that you would like to share. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on the theoretical and conceptual frameworks. Given that power and the exercise of power and we'll say the unequal, imbalanced power sharing agreements that exist or do not exist in Azerbaijan, rather, we can say that the work is situated rather neatly within critical theory. But I'd like to say as well that in Finland there's a geographer by the name of Anssi Pasi. He's been very influential in political geography and in the establishment and development of the subdiscipline of border studies. And what he's tended to do is, in a way that I'm also very interested in, he has also done a lot to interrogate how material aspects, how symbolic or discursive aspects of governance, how they play out at the grassroots level, at the local level, regional, state level, international level, to border and bound and other populations in particular contexts. So as I see it, involved in these processes of bordering and bounding and othering are commonly elite-led attempts to render populations knowable and governable. Rendering people knowable and governable not only to the government and to their authorities, but knowable and governable to themselves, in a sense that they come to view their own subjectivities in a particular manner, or that at least they're encouraged to do so, and they modify their behavior in a manner that is considered palatable or suitable to official interests. Of course, this is not to say that individual agency should be discounted in any way, shape, or form, but again, we need to note that in illiberal regimes, illiberal contexts like in Azerbaijan, the extent to which the individual is able to live out his or her life in the way that they see fit, voice their opinions, express their lifestyles, their identities, this is very much policed and surveilled. So this is something to keep in mind. But here in this aim of rendering people knowable and governable, I see a very clear link between the work of Foucault, which I know has often been overextended in many aspects, but I do find that it's very rich here. But his work on governmentality, and by governmentality here, I'm talking about how Foucault views the art of government as an exercise in governing the conduct of conducts within a given place and time, not only at the level of elites, but at the level of the individual self-government of oneself, governing the individual's content and conduct, rather. So it was with these things in mind that I decided to focus upon in trying to operationalize and develop Pasi's concepts of discursive landscapes of social power and technical landscapes of surveillance and control, which are dual concepts that are seen to be intermeshed and intertwined. And as I see it, we can consider these as tools of governmentality. And what I've done is I've sort of hyphenated them in this case because, again, they are interlinked, they are dual concepts. So what I find promising about the concept of what I call discursive technical landscaping is the way that It leaves us room to explore relevant issues at multiple scales, such as the site of even the individual body, and help to explain how these scales are mutually embedded and linked. And I think that it also helps us highlight the dual nature of landscapes as constructs that are symbolic and technical, affective, and effective. So when I'm talking about landscapes here, I'm pointing to the particular kinds of identities that are produced, reproduced, and contested within given bounded territories. So in this way, landscapes are constructs that are visible to the naked eye. They are produced in national legislation, listing the rights and responsibilities of citizens to the state and vice versa. They're reproduced in discourse by politicians, by elites, and in interpersonal communication at the grassroots level. And so in all of these ways, we can talk about them being reproduced even at border checkpoints or crossing points, as well as being internalized on an individual level. Next slide, please. So the sorts of hypotheses that I was working on developing in this paper, and I continue to do this at this present time, number one being that the authoritarian hardening of the political regime in Azerbaijan, particularly since 2003. What we have seen since this period is, I argue, an increased instances of violent policing of discursive technical landscapes in the country. And this has very real bearing upon identity, upon memory, upon state-society relations. And in this case, looking more specifically at the relationship that this has come to develop between the agenda-setting elites in Baku, which tend to be very closely concentrated within President Ilham Aliyev's political circle and in his personage himself. And for example, it's worth mentioning that his wife is the vice president of the country. And so what we have here is a political dynasty that is very much enmeshed and enshrined within particular personalities as well. And in this sense, the previous leader of Azerbaijan, again, Heydar Aliyev, the father of the current president, so again, political dynasty, cults of personality, this is all very, very relevant. But these sorts of relationships have played a role in the authoritarian hardening of the regime and the highly policed, surveilled atmosphere of dissent, of minority rights, expression, minority cultural expression, these sorts of things. And what I'm interested in learning more about in the future, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, is what kind of correlation exists between regime type and strategies for managing cultural diversity or minority rights. Surely there is some sort of correlation here. It seems so obvious, but you'd be surprised how little we can pinpoint these sort of correlations within contemporary literature. So I've been sort of thumbing through poli-sci literature and trying to find if there's anything that deals with this directly. So far I have not been terribly successful, but this is a work in progress. And I should say as well, I'm talking about border landscapes, and this is a concept as well that is rather nebulous, and in border studies we are still working to sort of define this in a way that is more or less coherent from one case to another. But here, let's say for the time being, suffice it to say that I'm talking about the sort of prevailing power-laden state of affairs that exists, involving interplays of us and them, state, society, political center, periphery, and these sort of categorizations that end up reproducing and disseminating and contesting even identity formations and formulations in borderlands, particularly, and among their borderland populations. Next slide, please. Okay. A little bit about the Talish before I get too much into this this presentation. I will say as well that the state of research is rather you can find information about the Talish language in Azerbaijan, but beyond this, studies on Talish identity are few and far between. What I can tell you is that in this map, I apologize that you can't see this very well, but if you look at Azerbaijan on the map And in the south, you will see a strip of blue territory. And it is in this territory that members of this Talish minority group are said to reside. So in Azerbaijan, they reside in primarily 9 districts in the southeast. Locals refer to these districts as the Talish region. And you can see as well that there are sizable populations of Talish across the border in Iran as well. And we need to make mention of the fact that although the official census of 2009, this is the last time that ethno-nationality was listed as a category in the census, but in 2009, 1.3% of Azerbaijan's population was considered to be Talish. And the numbers here are very spurious. This is also because in calculating that at the time the Talish was about the 4th most populous minority group in Azerbaijan, these figures are highly suspect because of the fact that also data from Nagorno-Karabakh was included, so Armenians were considered to be a very, very populous group, when we know actually that there had been quite a lot of out-migration from Azerbaijan proper of Armenians, and that there have been a lot of population shift within Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So it's more likely that the Talish is probably the 2nd or the 3rd largest minority in Azerbaijan. And activists assert as well that while the government likes to say that there are approximately 112,000 Talish residing in the country, activists say that this figure is highly problematic because, for one thing, there's a lot of self-censorship and fear associated with self-ascription as Talish. And also, some have come forth with stories about how when they were being asked to participate in the census, for example, the questions were posed as, well, are you Azerbaijani or are you Talish? And by, in a sense, not identifying as Azerbaijani, you were viewed then as having some sort of grievance against your country, and no one wants to be viewed as a traitor, for example, or as a security threat. So again, there's a lot of self-censorship, self-repression, and some irregularities in the census materials as well. Realistically, we're looking at closer to 200, 300,000 Talish living in Azerbaijan, with another 500,000, 600,000 in Iran. Okay, you said I have about 5. Okay, yeah. I have been rambling quite a lot. I'll say as well that there's quite a lot of bilingualism among members of this population, and that intermarriage is rather frequent. We've seen a language shift from Talish predominantly to Azerbaijani. These languages belong to 2 different language families. Talish is more closely related to Persian, or some people would prefer to say Iranian instead of Persian, and while Azerbaijani is a Turkic language. But the status of the Talish language in Azerbaijan right now, it's looking very much to be more and more endangered with each passing year. There aren't very many official structures or protections in place allowing people to develop the minority language, and even efforts seen in this respect toward the development of the Talish language are often viewed, again, as a security threat. We can talk a little bit more about this later. Maybe the next slide. Okay, so the Talish Mughal Republic, and there's a lot here that has not been studied, so I'll do my best here. Typically in literature, if you're going to find mention of the Talish Mughal Republic, it's a footnote, or at the very, very most, a couple of sentences, 2-3 sentences. And what I can say is that amidst all of this political intrigue and conflict, as I had mentioned, that had been going on in the country, an Azerbaijani general by the name of Ali Kram Humbatov took it upon himself to establish the Talish Mughal Republic in the south and in the east of the country. There's a lot of debate among activists as well about was the goal independent statehood for this republic, or was it autonomy within Azerbaijan? There's no consensus upon this at this time, and certainly pro-government media sources in Azerbaijan will never mention anything but secession in connection with this particular republic. And what we've come to see is that particularly since 2003 and when the transition of power between Ilham Aliyev and his son, Haydar Aliyev to his son Ilham Aliyev, when this occurred, we've seen more and more arrests of Talish activists, not all of whom are seen as having played some sort of role in this establishment of this republic in 1993. But definitely in the political cases that have been represented, that have been brought up against them, there's always some sort of mention of the Talish Mukhan Republic and the potential for separatism and the destruction of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. Yep, next slide, thank you. I'm afraid that I won't have time to get into a lot of this in great detail. I've been using up too much time otherwise, but what I've seen is from the data sources that I've come across, not the least of which have been interviews with activists who have spoken with me on an anonymous basis if they're living in Azerbaijan, or in a more open manner if they're living in the diaspora. We have seen that this policing of these discursive technical landscapes occurs in demographics, for example, in census materials, and even vocabulary that one is allowed to use. It's not commonly accepted or encouraged to refer to the region as the Talish region, for example. That smacks of separatism. And as well as in 2015, the name Talish was put on a list of shamed names that parents are not allowed to give their children, because in some way, shape, or form, this would be considered to be humiliating to the child for whatever reason. There have been a lot of claims that of aggressive, intentional language shift towards Azerbaijani and away from Talish, as well as forcible change of historical toponyms in the region. And maybe if there's a Q&A session, we can talk a little bit more about the specific cases that have been brought up against these Talish activists, if anybody is interested. But a recent paper that I just wrote talks about how discursive technical landscaping is also exercised through policing of the body and policing of these activist bodies in particular, not just their physical bodies, but the expressive functions that these bodies enable, for example. And this has had some really real reverberations for members of the community as a whole. It makes one really rethink the cost sort of benefit analysis of self-ascribing as Talish. What are you going to gain by doing so? What could you potentially lose by doing so? And we've mentioned the instances of shame or fear and self-censorship or even censure that stem from ascribing as Talish, and how this has, as a whole, stunted or restricted the development of Talish culture within Azerbaijan. Next slide, please. And as I had mentioned, that since this is a work in progress, there's a little bit of a typo on the slide, but basically it should be these hypotheses, number 1 and 2, still many questions, very few answers. And for my part, these would be very good points of departure also for discussion, maybe now, maybe later during other, maybe in the evening. But there's a lot that has yet to be learned here, as well as what the implications for study of NTA or TA might have for members of this minority group in Azerbaijan, and whether or not even daring to speak about these issues in the first place is a moot point, or if it could end up doing more harm than good to the minority in question, because again, when autonomy is automatically equated with separatism, not cultural autonomy. And again, I think it was someone in the session this morning, in the Q&A session, had mentioned that there are different interpretations, I suppose, between European and non-European associations or conceptions of autonomy. I think it was actually, you had mentioned that there are different definitions, and we find this very much in the Azerbaijani case as well. So that's thank you. That's my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll take immediate questions now, and hopefully we'll have some time to come back to pull the papers together at the end. So please, any immediate questions for Karli?
I would just have one. Oh yes, I can hear myself. That's not good. But okay.
We can hear
Thank you very much. Let me try to turn the volume down. I don't hear my echo. Am I muted now?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
You told me I was muted. Okay. So thank you. Fascinating. And I just wanted to the Talish. I came across the Talish when I was working on Russian Orientalism. Not much, as you say, given that there are so many minority groups and languages in that region. But there is one book, I don't know, called Peoples of the Caucasus from the 60s, and an article by a woman called Trofimova. You might have come across it, or if you don't speak Russian, maybe not, but this would be, I don't know, but probably you've heard of it, no? That article.
I'm guessing I have it somewhere in my bibliography list.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
So there are some, this would be just one woman that I can remember, Trofimova. There is a rich, well, I don't know how rich it is, but it would be maybe worth exploring that literature. If you're into, if it is anyhow part of your research questions. Just for, pure factual information, but also sometimes for this discourse of empire. Mm-hmm. That sometimes these Orientalists, consciously or not, pursued by trying sort of to portray the Russian Empire or later the Soviet Union as this protector of these people, which is, we can see, the troubling echoes of this sort of approach today. This is just a suggestion, and if more like a comment, but this is something I thought about maybe.
Yeah, and that's something that that's actually been coming out in the interviews that I've been conducting as well. Is when you're talking about kin-state relations and which country or countries is considered to be the kin-state of the Talish people. We will see, although in these footnotes that I had mentioned earlier, where you see the Talish Muhan Republic mentioned, typically Iran is listed as being the kin state. What we see is that the opinions are actually very divided among activists themselves, and there is also the propensity of certain strands of activists who are operating within this sphere to still view the USSR and the now contemporary Russia as a sort of protector of the Talish people, as a state that is better able to protect their interests, their rights, than Azerbaijan, than Iran. So that's an interesting point that I do think we see some bearing on that today as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that.
I have a question, if I may, if there's no one else.
Do I need to stay here? Sorry.
Please, yeah, then
okay.
I think we can hear, everybody can hear.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me online?
Matthias, can you hear David's question when he asks?
Oh no, I just heard his voice, something with online, but not a real question. No.
Okay. Well, I'll ask and then you can...
Sure.
It was a related question because I was interested in, the Soviet legacy and the degree to which there was any kind of institutionalization of Talish identity during the Soviet period, be it, local, the schooling in the language or any kind, not an autonomous republic, but some kind of local recognition. And yes, the kin state thing, I was wondering, we were talking about Gagauzia and the fact that, there will still be a tendency to look to Russia, the concept of Russian world. And I was interested, to what extent, well, first of all, how big is the diaspora, you might have said, but also, are there Talish, is this a trans-border population? Are there Talish populations in northeast Iran, for instance, and how those factors might play into the kind of securitization of the borderland? Thanks. Yeah,
so Matthias, I can repeat David's question in a nutshell if you didn't hear it.
I didn't hear the question, but I heard what he said about institutionalization. So that when the camera changed to him now, I just increased my volume.
Oh, okay.
But this was this to me? I thought this was to you.
No. I was just asking if you could hear, because typically just at these
Oh,
microphones.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, question to you, yes.
Yeah. So the Soviet legacy of institutionalization, actually, no, there was very little of that at place in the time. So we've seen very much that it's a continuation of much the same in independent Azerbaijan. There were times within censuses in Soviet Azerbaijan where one was allowed to identify as Talish, but this was very intermittent. And for the most part, there was encouragement of individuals to identify as Azerbaijani instead of as Talish. And again, any potential links with populations in Iran would have been highly discouraged, obviously, in political discourse as well. So there's some of that reasoning behind that as well. And kin state, and looking to the Russian Federation and the diaspora size. Regarding the size of the diaspora, that's actually a really good question that I don't have any figures on that at the time. What's been interesting is that there is a marked concentration of Talish transplants or expats living in the Netherlands, actually, that they seem to have rallied around this figure, this Alekram Pumbatov, when basically he was sentenced to death in 1996 for his role in the establishment of this republic. He was later pardoned by President Haydar Aliyev due to pressure from the Council of Europe. And as soon as he was able, he and his family members fled to the Netherlands, and they've been living in political exile ever since. And we've seen also a stream of activists also following him to the Netherlands. And actually, another interesting point here, there is a government in exile whose base of operations runs from the Netherlands. And Mr. Humbatov is the head of this government in exile. So needless to say, he has no opportunities to return to Azerbaijan at any point in the future, nor do his followers. Transborder population, yes, so as I had mentioned earlier, there's approximately 500 or 600,000 Talish living in Iran, just across the border. But as this border is highly securitized, policed, surveilled very heavily, the population, Talish populations on either side of the border are not encouraged or really even allowed to interact in any meaningful way. What I've heard from some of the activists speaking anonymously is that they have tried to create more connections between themselves and maybe youth on the other side of the border, individuals their own ages or these sorts of things, using social media, but in so doing they have to be very, very careful because the surveillance by the government is no joke. It's very real, it's very dangerous. So basically to keep all communication as closed, as encrypted as possible. But that in previous generations, their parents, their grandparents, perhaps even had familial ties on the other side of the border. But this is something that that in the post-Soviet and in the independence period has been less and less possible to keep those relationships alive and well and growing and developing. Does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A quick,
Yeah,
quick question.
just a quick, sorry. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. You heard a lot about NTA, I guess, during the conference.
Mm-hmm.
And you think that it could be, even the concept that you heard, European, doesn't matter if it's outside Europe, do you think that that could be or some sort of an NTA be applied in the Polish case?
I think that for me, one of the hurdles, as I've been reading more about NTA, is the fact that there are territorially concentrated minority groups in Azerbaijan, not just the Talish, but there's also the Lezgins in the north, for example, and areas where Ingilois live as well, that I sort of wondered how NTA would be operational in these sorts of situations when we do have these territorially concentrated minorities, so how that would work. I'm not so terribly sure. I think it would have to be some sort of hybridized system in order for it to make sense, and then of course there would have to be the political will and some basis of the protection of human rights or civil liberties, these sorts of things. So that's why I think that it's interesting to discuss these questions, like what sorts of base conditions ought to exist in the first place before we can even discuss the possibility of non-territorial autonomy or territorial autonomy for minority rights protection. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you again, Karli.
Thank you.